The colony on New Horizon had been one of the greatest successes of human expansion, the first real foothold in a galaxy that had once been thought unreachable. Its surface was a blend of advanced technology and lush alien landscapes. Human settlers had turned it into a paradise, a place where families could grow and thrive on the edge of the stars. It had taken decades of planning to secure the resources and technology to make it a reality, but they had succeeded, and for years, everything seemed perfect. New Horizon was a symbol of what humanity could achieve when they set their sights on the future, but all that changed in the span of a few minutes when the Zhirath came. They appeared from the blackness of space without warning, no signals, no demands, just pure, unfiltered destruction. The first strike came from above, the sky split open as if torn by invisible hands. And then the bombs fell, not like any conventional weapons. The Zhirath had tech far beyond anything humanity had seen before. Their weapons didn't explode in the traditional sense. They tore the air apart, collapsing the very fabric of reality, with each blast causing shockwaves that knocked buildings off their foundations and turned the atmosphere into a deadly maelstrom. The ground buckled and cracked beneath the settlers' feet. As cities collapsed into the earth, the skies were filled with fire and chaos, and in the middle of it all, the Zhirath descended like gods from the abyss. Their ships were monstrous bladed forms that reflected no light and gave off a sense of utter malevolence. They hovered above the crumbling cities as their soldiers began their descent to the surface, walking through the devastation as if it were nothing more than a passing storm. There was no time for panic. The colonists didn't have the luxury of preparing for a fight. They were farmers, engineers, and teachers, not soldiers. They tried to flee, but there was no escape. The Zhirath cut down everything in their path, their weapons slicing through steel and flesh. With ease, entire blocks were wiped out in seconds. The city's advanced defense systems flickered uselessly before collapsing under the sheer force of the attack. There were no warnings, no mercy, no chance to fight back. The invaders were everywhere, moving in perfect unison, as though they had planned this for centuries. Their brutality was precise, their actions deliberate. They weren't just conquering a world, they were erasing a civilization. Then came the screams, but they were cut short quickly. One by one, the settlers fell without a chance to fight back. The panic spread, but it didn't matter. The Zhirath were relentless and unyielding. They moved through the colony as if it were a hunting ground, and they were the predators. The killing was methodical. Entire families were erased in a matter of minutes. Some tried to take up arms, but against the might of the Zhirath, it was hopeless. No weapons humanity had could stop them. No tactic could slow them down. Was as though they had encountered an unstoppable force. The last transmission to leave the planet came from the main city hub, a soldier who had managed to get a signal out through the jamming, a simple phrase, barely more than a whisper, "They're here," and then static. The signal cut off, and New Horizon was silent. For weeks, no one knew what had happened to the colony. The first few ships that had been sent to investigate disappeared without a trace. The fear grew with every passing day. The galaxy held its breath, wondering what could have been powerful enough to destroy such a thriving colony. It was impossible to believe until the first unmarked ship arrived back at Earth's orbit. It was broken, battered, and burned, the crew barely alive, their eyes wide with horror and disbelief. They spoke of the Zhirath, but nothing could prepare humanity for what was coming next. The news spread across Earth like wildfire. The transmission from the broken ship revealed the horror of New Horizon and the Zhirath. The people of Earth were stunned in disbelief. No one could fathom the scale of what had just happened. The world watched as the footage of the decimated colony played on every screen. The images were clear enough to show that humanity's first great foothold in the galaxy had been obliterated in the blink of an eye, and the threat behind it was something no one had prepared for. The Zhirath were not just another alien race. They were something far worse. They had wiped New Horizon from existence without hesitation, and now humanity knew that no place was safe. The United Nations was thrown into chaos as every nation on Earth held emergency sessions. Some pushed for diplomacy, others called for an immediate military response. But the truth was that no one knew how to respond. No one had faced an enemy like this before. Humanity had fought wars among themselves, But this was different. There was no negotiating, no talking, no way to reason with a species that wiped entire colonies from existence. With no remorse, Earth's military forces were vast, but they had never fought against an enemy of this scale, of this power. The people of Earth demanded answers, they demanded revenge. And they wanted it now, but the military leaders knew they could not act hastily. This wasn't just about retaliation, this was about survival. The Jareth had proven they could wipe out entire planets with little effort, and there was no reason to believe they would stop with New Horizon. As the days passed, Commander Elias Quinn watched the chaos unfold from his command station. He had spent his entire life preparing for war, but even he had never imagined something like this. He was a soldier at heart, a strategist and a survivor, but the Jareth were unlike anything he had ever studied. Their tactics, their technology, their cold efficiency. It was as if they had been waging war across the galaxy for millennia. With no equal, Quinn was a seasoned war veteran who had seen battles that would break a lesser man. But even he could not deny the gravity of the situation. Earth's response would have to be calculated. Every move would need to be perfect, or the human race could very well be eradicated. Quinn stood before the Global Council with a clear resolve in his eyes. We do not know their full strength yet, but we do know one thing. His voice was steady and commanding. The Jareth have underestimated us, and that will be their downfall. The room was silent as his words hung in the air. For a moment, Quinn's reputation had earned him the respect of every nation on Earth. But this was different. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was survival, humanity's survival. We will not be caught unprepared, Quinn continued, his voice rising with the certainty of a man who had seen too much war to back down. We will show them the cost of underestimating us, and we will do it with everything we have. It was then that the true gravity of his words sank in. Humanity would have to take the fight to the Jareth in a way no one could have predicted. They would not just defend, they would retaliate with overwhelming force and vengeance. The decision was made. Quinn would lead the charge. Humanity's fleets would be assembled, and they would hunt the Jareth down no matter where they went, no matter how many ships they had. Humanity would burn through the galaxy until the Jareth paid for their attack on New Horizon. Earth's military leaders and top scientists worked together day and night to prepare a response. Humanity's vengeance would come at a cost, but the price of failure was far higher. Commander Quinn stood at the helm of the Revenant, watching the massive fleet assemble outside Earth's orbit, every ship a war machine of unimaginable power. The fleet stretched across space like a wall of steel and fire, each ship designed for one purpose: to seek out the Jareth and wipe them from the stars. It had been a long time since humanity had mobilized on this scale. Decades of peace had dulled the edge of war. But now that edge was sharpened to a point. Each captain, each soldier knew what was at stake. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the memory of New Horizon, for every life lost, and for every colony yet to be protected. The fleet wasn't just human, it was a collection of every force humanity had at its disposal: mercenary groups, military alliances, even the remnants of rebel forces that had once fought against Earth's government now stood together, united by a singular goal: vengeance. The warships ranged from towering behemoths with armaments that could level cities to sleek stealth ships capable of slipping through enemy defenses. Like ghosts, the unity of humanity's military forces was a sight to behold. Every nation, every faction had set aside their differences to fight this common enemy, and the message was clear: the Jareth would learn that humanity was not divided, but a single force capable of destroying any who threatened it. As Quinn surveyed the fleet's final preparations, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. This was no longer just a battle. It was a statement, a message to the entire galaxy that humanity would not be crushed by fear or by a single attack. The warships would serve as the embodiment of humanity's resolve. They would tear through Jareth space with the fury of a species that had been pushed to the brink but refused to kneel. He turned to his officers and gave the order to launch. Every ship would leave Earth's orbit at once, heading into the void to take the fight to the Jareth. They would cross the vast expanse of space and hunt their enemies wherever they went. Quinn's flagship Revenant led the way, its engines roaring to life as the massive ship cut through the silence of space. Its first destination was the outer rim of Jareth space, where intelligence had reported multiple enemy ships were gathering for reinforcements. The Revenant was not alone behind it. Came fleet after fleet, 1,000 ships, no two alike, but all bound by the same cause. The hunger for vengeance was palpable. It could be felt in every command given, every report sent. Every soldier aboard each ship knew that they were part of something far larger than themselves. This wasn't just another war. This was humanity's reckoning. The fleet entered hyperspace with a single collective purpose: to reach Jareth space and bring hell upon the invaders. As the ships hurtled through the vast emptiness, Quinn knew the hardest part was still ahead. They had no idea what kind of resistance they would face, no idea how deep the Jareth had dug into their homeworlds, or what kind of weapons they had hidden away in the dark corners of space. But Quinn was resolute. The Jareth had thought they could destroy humanity with one blow. They were wrong. Humanity's greatest strength was not its technology or its fleets. It was its will to survive, its refusal to bow to tyranny and destruction, no matter the cost. The silence of space was broken as the fleet emerged from hyperspace into Jareth territory. Ahead stretched the dark unknown, a place where humanity would make its stand, a place where the Jareth would learn the cost of their arrogance. Quinn's voice rang out across the comms as the fleet moved into position. "Prepare for battle," he said quietly, his eyes locked on the distant horizon. "Let's show them who we are." As the fleet emerged from hyperspace, the sight that greeted them was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Ahead stretched the endless expanse of Jareth space, a place so far from humanity's familiar stars. It felt like they were stepping into a whole new galaxy. The darkness of space was punctuated by the scattered remnants of destroyed world, signs of the Jareth's brutal conquest. Every planet they passed showed evidence of the aliens' path of destruction. Entire moons shattered to pieces, cities burned beyond recognition. Humanity had never seen war on this scale, but now they were going to meet it head-on. Quinn looked out at the dark void ahead, feeling a deep sense of purpose. It was no longer just about vengeance. It was about survival. Humanity had pushed back against the worst of themselves, but now they faced an enemy that could erase them from existence without a second thought. The fleet was massive, stretching across space in every direction, each ship commanded by captains who had sworn to carry out the mission with unwavering precision. But they were all well aware of the risks. The Jareth would not go down easily. Their technology was advanced, their tactics brutal and unforgiving. But humanity had something the Jareth hadn't accounted for, something primal, a drive that could not be extinguished. No matter how many battles were lost, no matter how many lives were taken, Quinn's voice echoed in every captain's ear. "We push forward no matter what. We do not stop until we reach them." His words were simple, but the weight they carried could be felt across the entire fleet. As they advanced deeper into Jareth space, the human ships moved in formation like a wall of unyielding steel. The smaller ships darted through the darkness, scouting ahead, while the larger warships formed the backbone of the assault. Quinn watched the reports come in from the scouts and knew that the Jareth had detected them, but they had not yet fully committed their forces. The humans were too close now, too relentless for the Jareth to ignore. Soon the first wave of enemy ships would arrive, and they would be ready. Quinn had trained his officers and crews for this moment. Every simulation had been run and rerun, every tactic rehearsed, until it was ingrained into their minds. But nothing could prepare them for the reality of battle against an enemy this ruthless. Suddenly a burst of light shattered the quiet of space. A fleet of Jareth warships appeared from the blackness, their forms twisting and sharp, their presence commanding. As they moved into position, the humans had been waiting for this moment, and they were ready. Quinn gave the order, "Engage," and the battle erupted in an explosion of light and fire. The Jareth came in waves, their weapons flashing out with deadly force. But the human fleet was prepared. They fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose, their warships tearing into the Jareth ships. With everything they had, the Revenant led the charge, its weapons unleashed in a deadly barrage. As the enemy ships fell like dominoes, the human fleets moved with precision, every ship a part of a larger machine, moving in sync as they pushed the Jareth back. But the Jareth were no pushovers. Their retaliation was swift and brutal. They fought with a cold, calculating efficiency that shocked even the most seasoned commanders of the human fleet. Their ships moved like predators in the dark, hunting down their prey. The battle intensified, and the casualties mounted. The void of space became a graveyard of twisted metal and burning wreckage, but humanity's fleets pressed on, never wavering. As the hours passed, the tide of battle began to turn. The Jareth forces were being driven back, but not without cost. The human ships had taken heavy damage, and many had already been lost. But Quinn knew that they couldn't afford to stop. They couldn't afford to let up now. The Jareth had taken New Horizon, but humanity had taken their first victory in this war, and it wasn't going to stop here. The war had just begun, and Quinn's resolve only hardened with every passing moment. He stared at the battlefield ahead, his voice cold and resolute as he gave his next order. Push them back into the dark. We finish this today. Battle raged on like a storm across the stars. The vacuum of space was filled with the roar of weapons and the screams of dying ships as the Jareth fought tooth and nail to hold their ground. The human fleet pushed forward with relentless precision, each ship brimming with the fury of a species wronged by an unforgiving enemy. But the Jareth were not easily defeated. Their ships moved like shadows, cutting through the firestorm of battle, their weapons striking with surgical accuracy and overwhelming force. They had lost the initiative, but they still fought with the cold efficiency that had earned them their fearsome reputation. Humanity's ships were not without their own losses. Several vessels had been torn apart by the Jareth's counterattacks, and their crews were now part of the wreckage drifting in the void. But the humans refused to back down. The first blood had been spilled, and it only made their rage burn brighter. Commander Quinn stood at the heart of the battle, his eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding before him. The Revenant was leading the charge, but every captain in the fleet knew that they had only one goal in mind: push the Jareth back and strike them at the heart of their forces. They had no other choice. Failure meant death, not just for the soldiers aboard their ships, but for the entire human race. They couldn't afford to hesitate. Quinn's mind raced through the strategies. He memorized the enemy tactics that had been studied for months, but nothing could prepare them for the pure malice the Jareth brought to battle. Every move was calculated, and they adapted with terrifying speed. Braced for impact, the warning came through the comms as the Revenant shuddered under the blast of enemy fire. But Quinn's grip tightened around the command chair. This was not a time for fear. This was a time for action, and his officers knew it. They fought with the same unrelenting drive that had brought them here, their hands steady as they returned fire. Every weapon on the Revenant unleashed in synchronized bursts, the forward railguns roaring as they struck Jareth ships with pinpoint accuracy, while the missile batteries fired a storm of warheads into the enemy lines. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos, and Quinn felt the surge of adrenaline as they carved a path through the darkness. The Jareth retaliated with a devastating counterattack, their largest warship emerging from the chaos like a behemoth, its weapons glowing with deadly energy as it powered up for a full barrage. The Revenant was already maneuvering hard to the side as its shields flared with each hit, but Quinn knew they couldn't keep dodging forever. They had to end this before the Jareth could recover. The battle had reached a tipping point, and the next move would determine everything. Target their flagship, Quinn ordered, his voice calm and commanding. All ships focus fire on that vessel now. It was a risky move, but it was the only one that made sense. If they could take down the heart of the Jareth fleet, they could break their morale and scatter their forces. The human fleet responded instantly. Hundreds of ships locked their weapons onto the Jareth flagship and fired as one. The concentrated fire hit the enemy vessel with brutal force, and for a moment it seemed like the Jareth might falter, but they fought on their flagship, retaliating with a barrage that sent shockwaves through the fleet. The Revenant took another hit, but Quinn refused to let the damage slow them down. Keep pushing, he barked. We are not stopping until that ship falls. The Jareth flagship was battered but still standing, its weapons firing in wild desperation. But the human fleet did not relent. Their fire intensified with each passing moment. The Revenant tore through the enemy's defenses with ruthless precision, and then it happened. The flagship exploded in a burst of blinding light. The shockwave rattled the ships around it, but the humans pressed forward, pushing through the debris as the Jareth flagship crumbled into nothing but dust and metal. The battle had shifted in humanity's favor, but Quinn knew this was just the beginning. The Jareth were not going to surrender after one loss, and the war was far from over, but this was a victory they could build upon. And that was all that mattered for now. The explosion of the Jareth flagship sent shockwaves across the battlefield, and for a moment the human fleet paused. The remaining Jareth ships hesitated as if uncertain of their next move, but Quinn knew better. They wouldn't flee, they wouldn't retreat, not after everything they had done, and not after they had tasted the blood of their enemies. The Jareth were brutal, but they were also cunning, and they would come back stronger and more determined than ever. Quinn watched the wreckage of the enemy flagship drift in space, knowing that this was only a temporary reprieve. The Jareth were not finished yet, and neither were the humans. Their victory today had been hard-earned, but it had come at a cost. Several ships in the fleet were beyond repair, and many soldiers had already been lost, their names now etched in the dark fabric of space. Quinn knew that every victory would have its price, but there was no time for mourning, not yet. They had to keep pushing forward. The war had only just begun, and the Jareth would not rest until they had crushed humanity's resolve. The fleet began to regroup, but Quinn could feel the tension in the air. The humans had delivered a blow to the Jareth, but now they needed to capitalize on its strike while the iron was hot before the enemy could regroup and call for reinforcements. Continue the assault, Quinn commanded, his voice steady but laced with urgency. We push forward, and we don't stop until they're driven back into the void. The fleet moved forward with renewed determination, but there was no time to celebrate, not yet. The human ships spread out in all directions in search of the scattered remnants of the Jareth forces. Every sensor sweep revealed the same terrifying truth. The Jareth were not retreating, they were regrouping, forming a new line of defense. Their ships had taken heavy damage, but they still had the firepower to fight back, and now they had learned from their mistakes. They were adapting quickly. The human fleet was strong, but it was not invincible. Quinn's mind raced as he analyzed the battlefield. The Jareth forces were reorganizing at an alarming speed. It was clear they had planned for this scenario and were preparing a counterattack. Report, Quinn's voice cracked through the tense silence as he turned to his communications officer. What's their status? The officer's hands moved quickly across his console as he sent out the latest readings. Enemy forces are regrouping, Commander. They're consolidating their ships at several key points in the sector. They're preparing a large-scale offensive. Quinn felt the weight of the words pressing down on him. The Jareth weren't just going to take their losses and retreat, they were preparing to strike back with everything they had left. We can't let them gain ground, Quinn muttered under his breath, his mind working overtime to form a plan. Prepare the fleet to split into 3 groups. He turned to his officers. Group 1 will stay on the offensive and continue pushing forward. Group 2 will reinforce the flanks, and Group 3 will move to intercept any reinforcements coming from their homeworld. The fleet was large enough to split into smaller forces, but it would take precision and coordination to pull it off effectively. We move fast, and we hit hard, he added. We don't give them a chance to regroup again. As the fleet shifted into its new formations, Quinn felt a sense of urgency building inside him. The Jareth had learned from their mistakes, and now they were coming for humanity with a vengeance. They were not going to let this fight slip away, not without one last attempt to crush the humans who had dared to defy them. The enemy was relentless, but so were the humans. They had proven their strength on the battlefield, and they would prove it again. The coming days would decide everything, and Quinn would not let this war slip into defeat. He would lead humanity into victory or die trying. The tension in the fleet was palpable as the human ships began to split into their new formations. The vast emptiness of space was no longer just the backdrop of a distant conflict. It had become a stage for a desperate battle. Humanity's survival hung in the balance, and Commander Quinn knew that each move would be critical. The Jareth were not just fighting to conquer, they were fighting to annihilate every human ship. Every human life was a target, And now humanity's ships were scattered in 3 groups, all moving with deadly intent. But the Jareth had not made their regrouping easy. Their new line of defense was formidable, and every second spent on the offensive increased the risk of encountering their deadly traps. Group 1 moved forward. We break their line and punch through to their core. Quinn's voice rang out across the comms as his flagship Revenant led the charge. The fleet had become an extension of his will. Each captain, each officer knew their orders. The human forces were coordinated and relentless, but there was no denying the pressure. Quinn could feel it in every report that came in from the other fleets. The Jareth were preparing their counteroffensive. Their ships were forming clusters at strategic points throughout the sector, and their tactics were beginning to mirror the precision of the humans themselves. Group 2 maintained the defensive perimeter, keep them from flanking us, Quinn ordered as the second wave of ships prepared to cover the flanks, their weapons primed and ready. Group 3 intercept any reinforcements coming from the Jareth homeworld. We cannot afford a second wave. The human fleet moved in perfect synchronization, each group a piece of the whole. No one ship or captain was more important than the others. They all had a singular goal: defeat the Jareth and drive them out of humanity's space. But the Jareth were not to be underestimated. Their forces were moving with lethal efficiency, and as the human ships advanced into enemy territory, it quickly became clear that the Jareth had prepared traps of their own. The human scouts had detected a formation of Jareth warships lying in wait behind an asteroid field. The Jareth had lured the human fleet into a carefully set ambush, and for a moment it seemed like the tides might turn. The human ships pressed forward without hesitation, their sensors flickering as the asteroid field closed in around them. And then the trap snapped shut. Enemy ships emerged from the cover of the field like predators pouncing on a wounded animal. Ambush. Quinn barked into the comms, all ships evasive maneuvers now. But it was too late. The Jareth had struck first, their weapons fired with terrifying precision. As the first human ships began to break apart, the human fleet scattered under the assault, returning fire in a frantic attempt to regain control. But the Jareth were relentless. Their warships encircled the human forces, cutting them off from all sides. Quinn's mind raced as he analyzed the situation. His fleet was being torn apart by the ambush, and they were losing ground fast. He could see the flanks of the human forces beginning to buckle under the weight of the Jareth's relentless attacks. He wasn't going to let it end like this, not after everything they had fought for. Group 1 break through the enemy lines now, Quinn shouted. Push forward with everything. We have hit them where it hurts. The human ships regrouped under Quinn's command. Their weapons roared to life once again as they tore through the Jareth formation with fury and precision. But the Jareth were holding their ground. They fought with every ounce of power they had, and the battle raged on. For hours, the two forces clashed in a brutal dance of destruction. The void of space became a graveyard of broken ships and scattered debris as both sides gave everything they had. The human fleet was outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. Their resolve burned bright in the darkness, and Quinn refused to let it be extinguished. He had seen the worst of humanity, and yet he knew they could survive this. They had to survive this. Reinforcements are on the way, Quinn's comms officer reported as the tide of battle began to shift. The remaining human ships were holding their ground just long enough for Group 3 to arrive from the other side. The Jareth forces were stretched thin as the human ships broke through their ranks and pressed forward. This is it, Quinn muttered under his breath as he watched the reinforcements cut through the chaos of battle. We end this now. The final push had begun. The reinforcements arrived like a storm crashing into the heart of the battlefield. Humanity's ships surged forward, tearing into the Jareth lines with renewed fury. The enemy forces had been stretched thin in their desperate defense, and now they were beginning to fracture under the weight of the human assault. The human fleet pressed forward, relentlessly striking with precision. Every shot aimed with the intent to destroy the Jareth had lost their flagship. But now they had lost their will to fight as well. The once organized lines of their forces began to break apart, and for the first time in this war, it seemed that the tide had truly turned. The Jareth ships attempted to regroup, but it was too late. The human fleets had already infiltrated their defenses, and the first signs of panic began to show. Target their remaining command ships, Quinn ordered, his voice calm but with the cold resolve of a man who had seen the battlefield's true face. We end this here. The human ships locked their weapons onto the scattered remnants of the Jareth command fleet and began firing with everything they had. The Jareth were trying to regroup, but their forces were in disarray, and they were no match for the coordinated onslaught of humanity's warships. The human fleet had learned from every mistake, had adapted at every turn, and now they were taking back what was theirs. Quinn watched as the enemy ships began to fall apart one by one. The Jareth's greatest strength had been their unity, but now that unity was shattered, their ships disintegrating under the overwhelming firepower of the humans. The remaining Jareth vessels scattered trying to flee, but it was no use. Humanity's warships closed in from every side, trapping them in a ring of fire. The human forces did not give them an inch, not a single moment to recover. Quinn's mind raced through the final movements. The Jareth had no choice but to surrender or die, and the latter seemed to be a fate many of them would choose. Push them back into the dark, Quinn muttered under his breath as he watched the final Jareth ships burn across the stars, the explosions bright enough to light up the surrounding space like a distant sun. The human fleet did not stop. The momentum of the battle was in their favor, and they were determined to finish it their way with their victory. But even as the battle seemed to be coming to a close, Quinn knew better than to think the war was over. There were still pockets of Jareth resistance scattered across the sector, still factions of their military leadership trying to hold out on distant worlds and moons. The humans had not yet won the war. They had only won this battle, this moment, and in war moments were fleeting. All ships stand by for further orders. Quinn announced, his voice over the comms. The Jareth may be broken, but their war is not finished, and neither are we. The fleet held position, their ships floating in the emptiness of space like a wolf pack surrounding its prey, their weapons still primed and ready. The human forces may have dealt a significant blow, but Quinn knew it wasn't enough. It was a victory, yes, but only the first of many to come. The victory had cost them dearly, but the Jareth would remember the name of humanity. They would know that humanity was a species that could not be broken. No matter how much destruction was thrown their way, humanity would rebuild. They would strike again and again, and with each strike they would grow stronger, more united, more determined. Prepare for the next phase, Quinn said quietly to himself. The galaxy was vast and unknown, and the Jareth had just learned that humanity would fight for every inch of it, no matter the cost. The silence that followed the battle was almost deafening. The once vibrant battlefield, now a graveyard of twisted metal and drifting wreckage. The Jareth forces had been broken, but not entirely destroyed. There were still pockets of resistance, scattered across the stars, remnants of their fleets clinging to life like dying embers in the cold void of space. Quinn stared out at the wreckage through the viewport of the Revenant, his face hard, his mind focused on the next steps. The humans had won, but it had cost them dearly. Every ship that had fallen was a reminder of how fragile victory could be. The human fleet had been pushed to its limits, but now they had to press on. They couldn't stop, not now, not after everything they had fought for. Quinn's voice crackled over the comms again, cold and steady. All ships report in one by one. The captains checked in, their voices calm but tinged with the weariness of battle. Fleet status screen. Came the first report, followed by others as the human forces regrouped. But the toll of the battle was clear. The fleet had been battered but not broken. Good, Quinn said simply, his voice holding a touch of grim satisfaction. Prepare for the next phase. He didn't need to elaborate. The order was understood. The Jareth had been pushed back for now, but they would regroup. They always did. And the humans needed to be ready for what came next. The war was far from over. It was only just beginning. Quinn turned to his officers, his mind already moving ahead. Our primary goal remains the same. We find and destroy every remaining Jareth force in this sector. We will not leave anything to chance. He paused, looking at his crew. We've dealt them a major blow today, but they will fight back. We have to stay ahead of them at all costs. There were no more speeches, no more rallies. It was all business now. The battle had been won, but the war was still to be fought, and humanity's survival depended on their ability to stay one step ahead of the enemy. The human fleet scattered across the sector, searching for any remaining pockets of Jareth resistance, their sensors sweeping every inch of space. For signs of life or movement, the warships moved with purpose, no longer as a united force, but as smaller units focused on wiping out every last trace of the enemy. No stone was left unturned, no corner of the galaxy left unchecked. Every world, every ship was a potential hiding place for the Jareth. They had to be thorough. But as the search continued and the human fleet pushed deeper into Jareth space, Quinn couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The Jareth had always been calculated, always seemed to be one step ahead. In the chaos of the battle, it had felt like they had been cornered, but now Quinn wondered if that was all part of the plan. Was this truly a victory, or had the Jareth simply bided their time, waiting for the humans to grow complacent? "Report," Quinn asked his intelligence officer as the uneasy feeling gnawed at him. The officer's fingers flew across the console. "Commander, we're detecting unusual activity near the outer rim. Jareth vessels are massing in small groups. It seems they've been reorganizing at a hidden base." Quinn's heart sank as the realization hit him. The Jareth hadn't retreated. They had been planning their next move all along. "Set course for the outer rim," Quinn barked. "Full speed ahead." The fleet shifted course immediately. The calm of the past few hours shattered as the ships accelerated toward the new threat. Humanity's victory had been temporary, and now they were walking straight into the heart of the next storm. Quinn clenched his fist, his mind already racing with the possibilities. This was the beginning of a new phase of the war. The Jareth were not done. They had just begun to show their true power, and the humans had to be ready for whatever came next. As the fleet moved toward the outer rim, Quinn couldn't help but think back to the lessons humanity had learned, the resilience, the strength, the unity they had shown. But there was no time to dwell on it. The battle for survival was far from over, and humanity had to keep pushing forward. They couldn't stop until the Jareth were driven back for good. "Prepare for battle," Quinn muttered under his breath, his voice a whisper of resolve. "We fight on."